What do we know about Jesus' private life, his family life? Was he somehow different from any other ancient Galilean Jew? Or was his life fairly typical of the day? On that score, it's fair to say that we can learn a lot about the Jews of the Second Temple period by studying the life of Yeshua, Jesus, and vice versa. That we can learn a lot about Yeshua by studying Second Temple Israelites. The best place to start is with the Jewish family. It's no exaggeration to say that the family was at the heart of Jewish society, and the father was its unquestioned head. Families in those days were large, and it wasn't uncommon for several generations to live under the same roof. Members of the extended family were expected to help in the well-being of all. Marriages were generally arranged at a young age, and a bride with a large dowry was a welcome addition to any family. A woman's duty was to look after the home, including the weaving of clothes. The wealthy families often employed slaves to do much of the work. A man generally had but one wife, though more were permitted by Jewish law. A woman could be divorced for any reason and could only remarry with the permission of her ex-husband. It was common for a childless wife to be divorced and for an unfaithful wife to be stoned to death. Boys and girls were expected to marry when they reached puberty, 12 and a half for a girl and 14 for a boy. A betrothal of 1 year preceded the marriage, during which time there would be much negotiation over the bride's dowry. On the eve of the wedding, the bridegroom and his companions came to the bride's home to fetch her. The procession followed, the bride being carried to the groom's home under a canopy of sheets painted with gold crescents. Her face was veiled and her hair extended beneath her shoulders. The procession danced and sang along the way, praising the bride. The celebration continued the following morning with games, singing, and dancing. In the evening, there was a great feast, the bride and groom occupying a place of honor beneath the canopy. The bride's veil was removed only when they left the celebration to consummate their marriage. But the festivities went on for a full week. It was the religious duty of a couple to have children, and the birth of a male child was an occasion for great rejoicing. 8 days after birth, the infant boy was circumcised with a flint knife. Only then would his name be revealed. We read in the Gospels, on the 8th day, when it was time to circumcise the child, he was named Yeshua, Jesus, the name the angel had given him before he was conceived. Luke 2:21. And speaking of children and their importance in family life, the Gospel of Mark declares that Yeshua had 4 brothers. He was the brother of James, Joseph, Judas, and Simon, it says in Mark 6:3. These are all, of course, Jewish names: Yaakov, Yosef, Yehuda, and Shimon. And James, Judas, the brother of James, and Simon are all listed as among the 12 disciples. Were Yeshua's brothers among his disciples? One possible scenario is that Yeshua's father, Joseph, died and that his brother took Mary to wife in accordance with the tradition of brother-in-law marriage. That is, if a woman's husband died, she was obligated to marry the brother of the deceased to raise up children in his honor. Why do we think Joseph may have died? Because there's a little detail in the book of John that tells us, "Now there stood at the cross of Yeshua, Jesus, Mary, the wife of Cleophas." The wife of Cleophas? What happened to Joseph? Now, a derivation of the name Cleophas is Alphaeus. And there's a little clue in Luke's gospel that one of the disciples was named Matthew, son of Alphaeus. Could it be that Cleophas or Alphaeus fathered children by Mary, naming one of his sons Matthew, but giving him another name, Joseph or Yosef, in honor of his deceased brother? It's an intriguing theory. Another theorized possibility is that Yeshua's family indeed hailed from Bethlehem, but that they relocated to the village of Nazareth in the Galilee. Yeshua himself would have been born around 6 BCE, but contrary to popular wisdom, his family wasn't poor. We're told that Yeshua was the son of a carpenter, the Hebrew term being nagar, literally a joiner, which could also refer to a stonemason. That was a respectable profession, and the family could afford regular trips to Jerusalem to attend festivals. Later in life, Yeshua mixed with well-to-do or wealthy friends or patrons, including Lazarus, Mary and Martha from Bethany, and Joseph of Arimathea. But Yeshua would remain in Nazareth and later Capernaum, where he established himself as a rabbi, teacher, and healer. Galilee, far from being impoverished, was a beautiful, very fertile country, justly praised by Josephus. According to his statement, it included a number of cities, many villages, the smallest of which had not fewer than 15,000 inhabitants. Now that's doubtless an exaggeration, though the density of the population is beyond question. In whatever city Yeshua was living, he would have had a splendid education from early childhood. By the time of King Herod, the Pharisees had begun a program to educate every boy in the land. This, of course, took place at local synagogues, which were actually houses of study. At the age of 5, a boy would begin a thoroughly religious education. He was taught to read so that he could study the Torah. General education was completed when the child reached puberty, which in tradition was at the age of 13. By then, he was expected to know the scriptures virtually by heart. Exceptional youngsters could continue their education beyond bar mitzvah age. And there were even adult education classes in every village. We hear nothing of Yeshua having any sisters, perhaps because the birth of a girl was a mixed blessing. The Talmud called them an illusory treasure who must be watched continually. Receiving no formal education, they helped with housework, spinning, watching sheep, and so on. Children of both genders played with toys and enjoyed games. Girls even had dolls. The second commandment, "You shall not make yourselves any graven image," notwithstanding. How did ancient Israelites live in terms of housing? Well, when the Franciscans excavated the Galilean city of Capernaum, they found blocks of houses, insulae, dating from the Second Temple period. They were crudely built of rough granite and covered with plaster. There are many interconnected rooms, some containing steps that may have led to a flat roof. Israelites loved to eat in the open, and meals were often taken up on the roof, which could also be used for storage. In warmer weather, visitors would sleep on the roof if there was no space indoors. As for clothing, people generally wore tunics made of two pieces with 2 stripes running down the front and the back. The tunic was tied with a linen girdle or hollow money belt. A rectangular cloak with notched stripe and often bearing gamma patterns was worn over the tunic and may have had a fringe or tassel, tzitzit, attached to the corners. It's an element that morphed into the prayer shawls of today. Women wore a veil covering their hair, and they were renowned for their love of jewelry, cosmetics, and perfumes. There were 5 major religious feasts: Passover, the Feast of Weeks, or Shavuot, the Harvest Festival, Tabernacles, the Feast of Trumpets on the 7th new moon of the year, and Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. When the first of 3 stars appeared on Friday evening, the Sabbath trumpet was sounded, and people ceased their labors. Supper was now served. The Sabbath day was, of course, dominated by the synagogue, a testament to the dominance of the Pharisees among the common folk. Lacking priests or sacrifices, the synagogue was governed by an elected committee. The service began with prayers recited by a single man standing before the Torah Ark, a portable cupboard containing scrolls of the sacred texts. Congregants joined in the recitation of prayers. Male Israelites would don phylacteries, tefillin, attached to the forehead and left arm, and containing scriptural passages reminding them of their obligation to keep the law, the Torah. Following the prayers, one of the scrolls would be taken from the ark and given to the first of 7 readers. The texts were read in rotation so that the whole Torah would be read within a set period. When a reader finished, he sat down and customarily delivered a sermon on the text. There were no specific qualifications, and anyone could fulfill this obligation. Archaeological evidence of ancient synagogues is scant, but the synagogue at Capernaum suggests that, unlike today's synagogues, in which the ark faces Jerusalem, it was the door that faced the holy city. Above all, we should point out that synagogues were houses of study more than places of prayer. They were by no means a replacement for the Jerusalem temple, but a supplement to it. They were community centers, and sometimes served as inns. The Hebrew word for synagogue, Bet Knesset, actually means house of gathering, and that well describes their function. Religious law, which came to be known as halakha, governed almost every aspect of daily life, especially when it came to eating. The pig and grazing animals that do not have cloven hooves were forbidden. The rabbit was also unclean. Animals had to be bled to death, since it was forbidden to drink blood. There were even cooking regulations. Lamb, for example, had to be roasted over a vinewood fire. Halakha dictated that at least the right hand had to be washed prior to meals. The food was blessed before a meal. Baruch atah Hashem Eloheinu melech haolam hamotzi lechem min haaretz, and thanks were offered afterwards. There were positions of honor at the table. Eating utensils were uncommon, and diners dipped into large bowls of food. Ancient Jews loved feasts, which often went on for 5 or 6 hours. The many festival days built into the calendar were an integral part of family life. Finally, as much as family life was governed by halakha, so was a person's death. According to Jewish law, the deceased were to be buried within 24 hours. In ancient Israel, the funeral was usually within 8 hours of death. Embalming, so as to preserve the body, was not practiced. Instead, the body was simply washed and anointed with perfume. In the first century, Rabbi Gamliel ruled that the deceased should be wrapped in white clothing. The hands and feet were bandaged, and the head was covered by a separate cloth. During the funeral procession, male relatives carried the body on a bier, with women walking in front. There was wailing and rending of clothes, and professional mourners were often employed. The poor were buried simply, sometimes in communal trenches. Wealthier families had tombs cut into the rock. Such tombs consisted of a rectangular chamber with ledges along the walls where the body would be laid out for a period of 1 year. Thereafter, when the flesh had decayed, family members would carefully collect the bones and rebury them in stone boxes known as ossuaries. They in turn would be placed into shafts called kochim, cut into the walls. The entire tomb complex would be sealed with a rolling stone. Once sealed, the tomb would be whitewashed to warn passers-by that there was a decaying body in that place. And this was to avoid becoming ritually impure due to close proximity with the deceased. Following the funeral, a family meal would be served. The mourning period extended for 30 days, and no labor was to be done on the first 3 days. What we've seen in all this is that Jewish law carefully regulated every aspect of life from birth until death. Judaism has never been about belief per se, but behavior. It isn't, strictly speaking, an orthodoxy, which literally means right thinking. Rather, Judaism is an orthopraxy, which means right behavior. And there was, moreover, no single Judaism in Second Temple times, as both religious ideology and observance widely varied. In fact, it would be more accurate to speak in the plural of Judaisms, several of which were alive and thriving in late antiquity. The relationship of those Judaisms to the historical Yeshua is what we'll take up next.